So now we're going to look at this chart. So this is a historical representation of what has happened going all the way back to 1913, right? And so this reflects the national wealth held by the top 1% of Americans going back into the 1900s. So just a few things I want to point out. So they call this the Gilded Age, right? And so late 1800s, early 1900s, as you can see here. So we got the early 1900s starting around here, the Gilded Age. This reflects when the Industrial Revolution was created. And so there was a ton of wealth created out of that. And it was extremely concentrated at the top. So, of course, you got names like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, right? Like these are all names that we are familiar with when you think about folks with money. Meanwhile, the factory workers were earning poverty wages with zero labor protections. Classic K-shape. So you got the Gilded Age that occurred here. And again, like I said, this is not a new situation. It has happened over a period. So that Gilded Age ultimately goes from the 1880s to 1929. Top 1% holds roughly about 40%, 45% of the wealth, as we can see here. Alongside that, those that were typically doing the work, these were the factory workers. These folks were, unfortunately operating in poverty. All right, then what happened? Two things. We had the Great Depression hit. Ouch. And then, rather than recovering in decay, the government made a fundamental decision. This is why when I hear all this, closing the wealth gap, I'm like, well, policy got to play a major role in that. One, we had FDR's New Deal, which was very important in supporting that. You had the GI Bill, which ultimately created the middle class. And then you had progressive taxation and then the union expansion. So from the 1940s through the 1970s, we actually had a compressed wealth gap, right? The middle class expanded dramatically. And that's that flat part of the chart that you see here. This is where you see it kind of flatten out, right? And it wasn't by accident. It was policy. So not only the assets and the decisions that the people made, there was policy that was put in place that helped accelerate households and individuals' ability to be able to participate in this wealth creation that was established. Then, as we can see what happens in the 1980s, this is when the Reagan era begins. And so there's significant tax cuts for the upper income earners. Similar to the conversation you hear now in regards to deregulation, the unfortunate decline of unions. Got to shout out my guy, DeMar Smith, the former executive director of the NFLPA, talks heavily on how they were able to really operate in the best interests of NFL players during his time of leadership. And, when you think about how that wealth gap starts to widen a good bit, these are part of the triggers that occurred. And so as you can see, that top 1% climbs from 22% back towards about 35%. So during the 1930s and the 70s, we can see that top 1% falls to 22%, and they were previously at 45% due to some of these policy that was established, the GI Bill, progressive tax, union expansion, and that compressed that wealth gap. But during the Reagan era, due to the tax cuts, due to the deregulation and the union decline, that wealth gap widens again, and that top 1% goes from 22% to then 35%. Very, very, very important. So the wealth gap widened again steadily. And then this is probably a crisis that we're all aware of. Then 2008 hits, the financial crisis. And this is where that K-shape really becomes clear. You can see due to some of the quantitative easing, which inflates assets, the market is able to recover. You got faster wages, recovered fast. You got wages being stagnant. That top 1% exceeds the 38%. And then food stamps hit a record of 47 million users in 2013. Here's some of the data right here. And so this gives really a reflection of, again, those that have assets. When events happen like this, what occurs to those that do not have assets, and how are they able to essentially recover? So after that 2008 crash, the stock market recovered to pre-crisis levels by about 2012. home prices in major markets recovered by 2013. So 4 years from the 2008 crash, it got back to where it was. And then 5 years after the crash, home prices were able to recover by 2013. And corporate profits, guess what? Guess what they did? They hit record highs. But unemployment for working class Americans, it took until 2016, 8 years, 8 years to recover to the job loss in 2008. And then real wages for the bottom 50% barely moved during that entire decade. So food stamp enrollments hitting a record of 47 million in 2013. You got the Fed's quantitative easing, essentially buying assets to inject money into the economy. So it inflated the stock market and real estate. So if you own those things, you got rich. If you didn't, you got nothing. Then, of course, through 2020, in 2020, here comes COVID. And we see it again, but faster and more extreme. The stock market crashed in March of 2020, and then it recovered to all-time highs by August. By August. Just that quick. 8 months. That is one of the fastest recoveries in history. Meanwhile, by December of 2020, 20 million Americans were still claiming some form of unemployment assistance. So the K-shaped was not only sharper, it was faster, more visible than ever before. And that pattern is not over. So where are we now? And again, I'm going to highlight a few of these things that we talked about. 2008, 4 years to recover. COVID took 5 months to recover in regards to the market. The amount of billionaire wealth during the COVID era increased by $1.3 trillion. $1.3 trillion. And so it took 8 years for jobs to recover, but it barely took a year for the market to recover. And so it's one of those things where once you see how the economy works and the role that you can play alongside of it, it's going to be in your best interest to own assets. So in both crises, Wall Street recovered in months and Main Street took years. And Main Streets are ultimately the folks that are the working class. So who owns what in America? And I think this is very important to get an understanding of, like, all right, where am I and how can I get on that other side of it? Because the K-shaped economy is very much alive in this current environment.